Hello and welcome to the Property Trio podcast, the podcast for the sophisticated property investor. Today we've got a great listener question that I think a lot of investors will relate to because it's not just about property. It's about the human side of investing and what happens when a tenant situation starts to wear you down. Our loyal listener, John, has owned an investment property in Canadian in Ballarat for about 8 years, not to confuse with his heritage being Canadian. I believe he's probably Australian, but it's a 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom house on a big 900 square metre block at the end of a court, but the home itself is older and in average condition. They've got a long-term tenant who is often in arrears and is currently on a month-to-month lease. And John is starting to feel like the future prospects aren't that bright. So they're wondering whether they should sell, and if so, do they remove the tenant and freshen the property up with paint and carpet, or sell it as is with the tenant in place? So this is certainly a scenario that I think everyone who owns or has owned a investment property can relate to.
Especially
Kate,
in Victoria.
yeah. So, Kate, this is right in your wheelhouse, and you've pulled today's episode together. So, I might start with you. How often do you see investors get to this point where the tenant situation starts influencing the strategy?
Yeah, more often than people can imagine, Dave. It's when we talk about property strategy, we tend to focus on the growth rates, the yields, the timing, but in reality, tenants can make or break the experience of owning an investment. If you've got someone who's constantly in arrears, even if the property's grown in value, the holding experience becomes stressful. And when the investor feels stressed, they often start questioning the whole strategy, even if the original purchase made sense and the strategy is still good. Now, in this case, the property sounds like it has good fundamentals. It's a large block, court location, regional city with solid demand. Canadian's a nice pocket in the southern pocket or southern section of Ballarat. And, it's got a really good blend of houses. I'd say there's probably there's more houses than units in Canadian. And there's really good transport links into the city. So, tick for location. But I make the point that Victoria's been a really tough investment location for the last 4 years. We've had very static growth. And when you're dealing with challenges as well, the challenges can feel like they're being amplified. Now, the condition of John's home and the tenancy situation are working against him. But the real question is, do you hold it and persevere? Do you fix it up and sell it? Or are there any other things that we can consider for John?
Yeah, well, I look forward to unraveling the answers to that during this episode, Kate. So when someone is thinking about selling in that situation, how do you decide whether to spend money first or just sell as is? I'll go to you again.
Yeah,
here,
it comes
Kate.
down to... Sorry, Mike is sitting there listening in about Canadian.
I'm still here.
It comes down to buyer appeal versus the cost. It's got to stack up. There's a cost-benefit analysis that has to take place. Basic improvements like paint, carpet and minor repairs can make a huge difference, particularly for owner-occupier buyers. And in markets like Ballarat, the owner-occs are often the ones that will pay a stronger price, although I'll put a caveat around that. Ballarat's having a particularly good run right now. We're getting a lot of interstate investor activity there, and sometimes some of the really peaky, silly prices I see, interstate investors or BAs buying what they think are off market. That's a great way to get a good price for a property in Ballarat. But all that aside, if the tenant is in place, particularly one who's behind in rent, you're limiting your buyer pool mostly to investors if you're keeping that tenant on for the sale. Investors will factor in the fixes or the risk of maintenance issues being difficult to deal with while the property's tenanted, and they'll factor that into their offer. So in many cases, removing the renter, issuing them a notice to vacate, tidying the property and presenting it well can definitely be a good solution. Not to mention from an ease point of view, you're able to make your modifications and not have to, dance around a tenancy and all of the restrictions associated with getting access. Now, our Victorian rental laws have progressively made it much harder for owners to deal with maintenance or sales with a renter in place. We have legislation that now supports the renter being able to resist someone having through without 7 days' notice, and they also are entitled to being paid when the agent brings buyers through. So all of that can just be quite nightmarish for a landlord, especially when you're trying to deal with repairs and you're having to give 7 days' notice. It's very hard to coordinate trades to do fixes when you're dancing around a tenant that may not want to give you access. So in a lot of cases, issuing the notice to vacate and getting the works done and selling the property is the easier solution for a lot of landlords, sadly.
Yeah, look, the government certainly has made it quite difficult for landlords in Victoria on many fronts, unfortunately. Mike, I might bring you into the show at this point. You've sat there idly on the sidelines, listening very intently. From the numbers side, how damaging can a bad tenant actually be to a long-term investment?
Well, it can be shocking, and I suppose like even more damaging than the financial stuff in the short term is that John's considering selling what could be an asset in one of the best SA3 locations for 2026 for growth, right? I don't know that to be true, but I can see in our own data that our investors are very, very active in Ballarat right now. So selling the property because the tenant's giving you a headache is not necessarily strategy. It's a knee jerk to what they're bringing to the table. And I hate that for John. And I feel like Victoria especially, and in a lot of places around the country, we've got the balance wrong. It's a fairly simple arrangement. You have exclusive rights to the property and you pay the rent. And really, I feel like there's been too much intervention in that. But that's a whole nother podcast. But you're not just losing rent, you're losing that certainty. And of course, that affects the cash flow and also the planning. And that's what I was referencing before. And over 8 years, if the property hasn't been improved and the tenant situation's been difficult, you've got to look at the opportunity cost. Could John have taken that equity and put it somewhere else? Could he have upgraded, diversified, reduced the risk? Could he have had shorter term tenants in there and used a period of vacancy to renovate and improve? There's a lot that sort of goes into this. And sometimes the biggest mistake isn't buying the wrong property, it's holding a property for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, they're all good points, Mike. So we need to continue to unpack what is the right pathway for John here. And a big part of the question is, does he have a quality investment or not? So how should investors think about timing here? The listener mentioned maybe selling now or maybe waiting until next year. What do you think, Mike?
Well, I think let's hear option C, which is not selling it at all. We don't know enough about John's particular situation, but I just hate the idea that he's gone down this track of I'm either selling it now or I'm selling it later because of the situation that I've got in with the tenant. I would be asking a please explain with the property manager, and if it's self-managed, I would be getting a proactive property manager in there. If we're talking about waiting, it only really makes sense if we can bring it up to a standard that makes it more attractive on market, or the property is going to be growing in value. So if the tenant situation isn't improving and the condition isn't improving and the strategy isn't improving and the market's doing nothing, then time alone isn't going to fix it. Markets do move, and I see a lot happening in Ballarat at the moment, but so do holding costs, stress levels and missed opportunities. So a clean exit done property can sometimes be the best move.
Cate, last one to you. If this were your client, what would be the key factors you'd look at before deciding?
Yeah, I'd look at 3 things. First, who is the most likely buyer for the property? If it's an owner-occupied, then presentation really matters. Second, what's the cost of improving versus the likely uplift in price? Not renovations, just smart cosmetic work. The last thing an owner wants to do is risk overcapitalisation. And third, does the property still fit the long-term property strategy? I think that's the really critical question. If the answer to that last question is no, then the goal shouldn't be to squeeze the last dollar out of the sale. It should be to exit well and redeploy the capital into something more optimal.
You make an interesting point, Cate, about overcapitalisation, especially when the plan is to sell the property in the short term, something that you can come up against. Do you see that a lot?
Yeah, all the time. Whether it's a case of a vendor overindulging a property with, a superb refit that's more than the market's prepared to pay for, or whether it's a really cheap looking renovation that leaves more questions than answers. I've seen countless renovation efforts that have resulted in a vendor being further out of pocket than if they'd just sold as is. And what I mean by, leaving more questions than answers, if a renovation is rough enough, rushed enough, DIY enough, I will be scratching my head and asking questions to myself. What's it hiding? Have they eliminated some important things, like, for example, bathroom? Are they missing the water membrane? They're the questions that come up when a renovation is poor quality and looks really DIY.
Yeah, 100%. And there's always the risk that people will overcapitalise, isn't there, and spend too much on the renovation for a sale, which from my experience I've found is probably more often the risk with our clients over the years.
Yes.
How about you?
I'd agree.
Yeah.
All
right.
Overcapitalise, well, spending more than what you're going to get back. If you're not getting a good return on what you're doing, you don't want to just do it to break even or to get an extra $5,000, because you've got to factor in your time and risk into that. You have to get a genuinely good return on your investment if you're planning on doing an improvement.
Yeah, and then it tends to take longer, and if you've moved a tenant out,
overcapitalised properties.
Yeah, so if you do decide to tidy up the house upon sale, and it did have a tenant, and then you get caught up in the renovation, so you not only overcapitalise, you don't get your money back, you spend longer on the renovation than you intended, and if you've also moved a tenant out, you're losing that rent as well. So, and you're paying more interest for longer. So the compounding effect can be multifaceted, which people often won't consider. They'll lose themselves in the process of renovating. Mike, what do you think the fundamental things are that vendors get wrong when they overcapitalise on the renovate to sell project?
Look, I want to sort of challenge that notion outright. I love overlooked capitalisation, Dave, especially if it's done by the previous owner, because the new purchaser can depreciate the value of all of those improvements. So it's the one time where it actually works. It's a bit like tax depreciation. It's the one time where paying more tax than the person next to you is actually a good thing, because if you're on a higher marginal rate, the deductions go better. It used to be better pre-2017, where you could claim the plant and equipment deductions when you are not the first user of those. So, the carpets, the blinds, all of the kitchen appliances. These days, it's really just the structural improvements, which can include bathrooms and components of kitchens. But there's a number of reasons why vendors get this one. The obvious one is underestimating what those actual costs are. And often, if we're going into a fairly serious renovation, we uncover issues that are hidden behind the scenes as well. We may need to do some plumbing that we didn't plan for, or some electrical works, or there's just every time you're pulling things apart, there's a risk that something bad can be exposed there. But another one is underestimating the task. So some do-it-yourself owners throw themselves into the job not realising that they can't actually finish what they've started, and then finding trades. We've had whole episodes on construction costs and supply and trade shortages. Finding trades within a tight time frame when you've got the pressure of that tenant not being in place potentially to come and fix the blunders of an owner can be expensive. And one thing that people don't necessarily understand is we do this quite a bit with construction projects. If someone's building a house and that builder goes into liquidation or disappears or gets hit by a bus, a new builder has to come in, and you would kind of think, okay, if they've done 50% of it, then 50% of the cost, and we can get this finished. But that new builder has to accept the works done by the previous, and some of that isn't inspectable. And in some respects, that trade has to accept what the owner's done to that point in time. One of the more significant mistakes, though, relates to making structural changes without permits or applying trade work without the proper certificates or insurances. And I'm sure that Cate has lots of juicy horror stories about this, but that can really bite you on the backside when it's time to sell that to the next party and they're making their inquiries about how legal the improvements are.
Oh, well said, Mike. I can't tell you how much this bothers me. We walk away from so many great properties that have had an illegal modification or they've been updated without the required certificates. And, the first thing a buyer who's doing their DD will do is send the contract through to a solicitor or conveyancer, and it'll be picked up straight away. I know what to ask for and what to look for. When I walk through a property, I can see that, it's got a sparkling new kitchen or new bathroom or new deck or pod office in the backyard, whatever it might be. I know what needs a building permit. If it's structural, I know when things need a planning permit. I know when there's meant to be a formal sign-off of works, but I also know what trade work needs certificates. You want to see your plumbing certificates, your electrical certificates, your waterproofing certificates. And the vendors that do these works and do it on the cheap, they pay Bob at the pub with, a couple of slabs of beer, or they do a contra deal and, I'll spray paint your house if you can do my plumbing, whatever it might be. When you're doing it without certificates or without permits when they're required, you're really creating an issue, because the buyer will look at that and their solicitor or conveyancer will tell them, you're taking on this liability. And the worst case scenario is that it's done badly and someone gets injured or killed and there's no insurance and you're culpable. And some of the more upsetting but not lethal outcomes of things like this is that you can't get insurance coverage. Council might offer you, they might issue you a show cause. They might place an order on the property. You might have to unravel the thing that was built. All of these are nightmare situations for buyers. And when they get legal advice, they're made well aware of it. And you've then got a situation where the vendors put money into a property and they've created a liability that no one wants to buy, and they've actually devalued a house that looks like it's got improvements.
Cate, are there ever circumstances where you would say, in your view, look, it's okay, even though you're meant to go through council for this, it's such a small thing. Let's say it's like a basic fireplace, for example, in a house, and the cost and the delay and the hassle might increase significantly, but technically you're supposed to get it approved by council, where you would say, look, it's only a small change. I wouldn't worry about it.
I'll never say that, but it's a great question, because there's a bit of a matrix that I use to help someone determine whether a non-permitted or non-certificate supplied set of works is forgivable. The way that I look at it, Dave, is firstly, is there liability risk and an inability to get insurance? If either of those, if the insurance isn't available, then it's a flat out no. I can't have a client buying property that might not have insurance cover.
So as a buyer's agent, if you found, even if it was something small, but you would totally drop off that property. Yeah. That would take you out from buying it at all, even if you thought the risk was pretty low.
The matrix that I use is related to risk and potential outcome. So if it's low risk but high outcome, high bad outcome, I'll walk away. If it's low risk and low bad outcome, I'll stay. And if title insurance can cover it, I'll stay. Also, if losing it doesn't represent any value loss to the client, I'll stay. So, for example, if a deck's been built illegally and it's not that great a deck, I'll talk to the client about factoring in building a new deck, and we'll stick with the plan. If the house has had structural work's done and the insurance cover's just not going to be available, and the property, if the council knew about it, would be likely to attract an order, we'll walk away.
The reason I ask is I just happened to be a party to a conversation last week in a country town where actually a friend of mine who project manages small-time developments for a business, so like developments where they'll buy a block, subdivide it, get an extra property onto the block, maybe, so there'll be 3-4 developments on the blocks. That's his job, and he just had someone who I don't know, a friend of his, asking him about actually this situation, a fireplace, and he said, he said don't bother with going through council because of the costs and the headaches, etc. But yeah, so I was just interested to get your thoughts. Hopefully, I haven't dobbed my friend in too much. He does listen to this podcast from time to time, but yeah.
You didn't name names.
No, exactly. So thanks, Cate. I just thought that was an interesting side topic to touch on, which I'm sure plenty of our listeners will have come across or thought about along the journey, whether it's doing works themselves or buying a property that has had works done that should have been approved. So really appreciate that, your insights there. So look, this is Cate. Thanks, Cate and Mike. This has been a good reminder for any aspiring sellers to consider the risks of transformative renovation and the risk it can carry when not done properly. Before we close out this great ep, let's talk about the emotional toll and the sense of fatigue and why we need to be prepared to ride these waves as investors so that tenant woes don't cloud our judgment and cause us to sell what otherwise might have been a great asset if we just had have ridden out the tougher times. And look, this actually goes to also riding out the tougher times where, let's say, rates are rising, or let's say, there's been an impact on your cash flow, but you can hold a property. You're starting a family, but you could hold the property, but it's just feeling tougher for a period of time. But that might only last a month, 3 months, 6 months. And in the long run, if you manage to hold through that time, even though that period feels real, like it's dragging on for a long period of time while you're living through it, the challenge is for us all is to recognize that over the long run in life, that this is just actually a blip. And if we can get out the other side holding on to an asset, it can make a significant difference to our retirement outcomes. So, Mike, what's your best advice for owners who find themselves in a situation like John's?
Well, I feel like, to your credit, Dave, you've cut my grass a little bit there, because I think we think so much about like the short-term pain, and there's no doubt that there's pain with that tenant who's behind, kind of thinking, gosh, it really does need a freshen up, but we've got to deal with the tenant. But I think you've just got to be a little bit, I suppose, removed from the emotions as much as possible. Emotions are rarely helpful in making astute financial decisions. So, the pain of dealing with the tenant, or perhaps removing them, maybe having a property that's vacant. Let's say it's vacant for a month, and I'm sure that the median rent is going to be less than $1,000. But let's just say it costs you $4,000 to have this property vacant and make those improvements. If they're smart improvements, they may not necessarily add 2 times the dollar spend, but they could just actually make that property campaign run smoothly and get good competition from investors and owner occupiers. And let's just say they pay for themselves, and there's really only the $4,000 demand that needs to be factored in. Well, $4,000 over the course of 12 months or over a sales campaign is actually not that much. And if we're talking about $4,000 of loss so that you can get a new tenant in, you can freshen it up, you can increase the rent that you're getting each week, that $4,000 can disappear very, very quickly, especially in an appreciating market. So I just kind of think you've got to run all the scenarios and try and remove the emotions and forget about any of that baggage with the tenant, because the financial differences between holding an appreciating asset and then getting rid of it just because you've had enough is very, very significant.
Great summary there, Mike. Cate, what about you? Do you have any hot tips for landlords to avoid this type of stress?
Yes, I do. I think having a great property manager is such a fundamental requirement, because the property manager's role isn't just to keep the tenant experience and the relationship stress-free. It's to manage the maintenance as well, not just being reactive to stuff that needs fixing, but making sure that the condition of the property is kept up to scratch for long enough so that you haven't got degrading things that are suddenly becoming, urgent matters. And so having a great property manager doesn't guarantee that you won't have a troublesome tenant, because people's situations in life can change. Troublesome things can come along and create havoc for a tenant, and their world all of a sudden changes. But it gives you a much better chance of getting a tenant who will be the right fit for you and for your property. And you've also got that channel of communication then, so that you can have access to do the things that you need to do. And the maintenance reports are done on time, and you're avoiding this kind of problem. Now, when it comes to tenants who are in arrears, that's a pet hate for any landlord, because you can't say to the bank, look, I'm sorry, I won't pay my mortgage this month because my tenant's been a bit late. It doesn't work like that. And having a buffer is really important, because tenants can go into arrears. You've got to get to the heart of the issue, though. What's causing them to be in arrears? Is it no longer the right property for them? Has their life changed and they need something that costs less? Are they just habitual late payers? A good property manager will absolutely sort that one out. And in Victoria, unfortunately, like a lot of states that have had, changes to their rental legislation, can't just evict a tenant if they're not paying the rent on time. You have to then take them to the tribunal, and that might be months and months of waiting. So you definitely need to have really good buffers to ride through that. But I circle back to the need for a good property manager and great communication. I've seen plenty of situations where, with good communication, a tenant who's constantly been in arrears has been able to work through with the property manager a change of home. They've been able to pick a location and a property that's more suited to them. They've been able to get released from their lease. They've gone on a payment plan. A proactive, good communicator will be able to facilitate something like that without it having to go to the tribunal.
Well, look, that's been a great discussion today. Bad tenants are one of those things that don't show up in spreadsheets, but they can absolutely change the trajectory of an investment. So if you've ever wondered whether to hold, fix or sell, and we've done an episode on whether to hold them or whether to sell them or fold them as well, and me and Pete sung at the end of the episode as well. That was in our first 20 or 30 eps.
Wow, I missed out on that
one. This is the kind of strategy conversation every investor should be having from time to time. So thanks for the great question, John. We've enjoyed unpacking this one, but don't go anywhere. We have our gold nuggets.
Now it's time for us to go mining for our gold nugget property tip of the day.
My gold nugget is short and sweet, and we mentioned this. You've got to ask yourself a key question. Does the property still fit the long-term strategy? So forget about the tenant woes and all of those challenges. You can work around that. Does this property still fit your long-term strategy? If the answer is yes, I would be working with your property manager to either rehabilitate the tenant and their attitude towards paying their rent and giving access for trades to come in and do necessary fixes, or I'd be working through with your property manager how you can give a notice to vacate on the grounds that you need to do some updates and renovations to this property, they will know the legislation inside out and have a really good chat with them, because if it does fit your long-term strategy, you don't want to let a good property go just because you've had a sour experience with a tenant. And I think this applies to anyone who's sitting there with a property in their portfolio that's attracted a more challenging tenant. Don't lose sight of the end game.
My concern is that property could very well suit their long-term strategy, because, as I mentioned, Ballarat's having a real resurgence at the moment. There's a lot of eyeballs on that location nationally. We're starting to see it in our data. I think there's a very real chance it could be in the top I would say probably the top 3 statistical area 3s for investors in 2026. So I would just encourage to follow up on Kate's question. If it fits, then stick with it and get the right property manager in place. I never like the idea of someone selling a property because of the tenant. Like, the property is far more important than that contract that's in place to that tenant, and a good property manager should be able to fix any bad tenant.
And just one little thing here, John, if you aren't convinced that you've got a great property manager, please drop us an email or a message and I will give you one. One of my favourite property managers on the planet is a Ballarat property manager who's amazing.
Well, there you go, John. You've got no reason not to make sure that you're at least exploring your options if that is a good asset and moving through this difficult time with a challenging tenant by the sounds of it. So hopefully that's been helpful to you, John, and also to all our listeners. I've certainly enjoyed playing host and sitting back and listening to the pearls of wisdom from Cate and Mike throughout this episode. But that's it for us this week. We look forward to joining you all again next week.